So I want to start by looking at session minutes. You will find this on pages 3 to 6 of your handbook, some of this material. Robert's Rules and the Book of Order give us general guidelines for what to include in session minutes. And recording session minutes is much, much easier if you write out what you can ahead of time and then just leave the outcomes blank. Right? If you know motions are coming and you have them there, you've got a real start on what's going on. If you know that a committee is going to be asking that there'll be a change in the budget in a certain way, and you've got that, you've got to start if you've already got that in. So good word of advice, start with an outline ahead of time, filling in already what you can. Yeah?
I've found that, being rather new at this and terrible at paperwork, that if I just take the agenda that I already had printed
Right.
and fill in the outcomes and make it a paragraph.
Right. You've got your minutes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a great way to do it. Exactly.
However, if your minister decides to go
Rogue?
rogue,
Yes. Then you've got a problem. Then you've got a problem. And that's why you want to talk about the agenda ahead of time with your minister to say, here's what we're going to be doing. Here's the agenda. Do you have any problem with going through this agenda? So the minister doesn't come in and say, well, let's look at number 8 on this list and skip everything else.
okay.
Right? That's part of working well together. So you should start with writing out ahead of time, if you can. Keep a copy of the minutes review sheet with you. What is the minutes review sheet? It's that form you filled out for today's minutes review that says these things have to be in there. Meeting must be open with prayer, right? Must be closed with prayer. You need to report who's at the session meeting. That will help you so you can look at it and say, do I need to put this down when something comes up? If you have that somewhere in a folder and you're not sure, you can look at it and see whether that so you don't just pull that out come February when you get my email saying we're having a clerk of session day in March or May or whenever it is. You have it there ahead of time. Make sure meetings begin and end with prayer. That's required by the Book of Order. Your minutes should reflect that very clearly. And who did the prayer is always a good thing to have down. If you're not sure if you're going to have a pastor who will do the prayer, you should be prepared to do one, just in case. All right? Some clerks carry a prayer. If they're uncomfortable with spontaneous prayer, and I know some clerks are, they carry a written out prayer that they keep with them in case they ever need to use it. And that's not a bad thing because there are occasions where it needs to be used. You need to put in basic locating information. What I mean by that is on your minutes, it should make clear what your church's name is, the time and date you met. So we met on this day, starting at this time. The type of meeting you're having, is this a regular stated meeting of your session, or is it a called meeting? If it's a called meeting, what is it called for? What's the purpose of the meeting? The name of the moderator, your name as clerk, and not only the time you began and the time it was called for, but when did you actually begin and end? That should be in your minutes. Right. Why do you need to put the name of the moderator if it's a guest moderator? Because minutes need to be signed by moderator and clerk. All right. So you're going to need to track down the person doing it. Moderator and clerk, technically.
That's not every session or congregational?
Congregational meeting always. Ideally, session meetings as well. Ideally, session meetings as well.
The pastor should sign the everyday.
Ideally, session meetings as well. The reason for that is this is saying that this is your, and here you have the lawyer and me talking. Let me take a step back. Book of Order requires the clerk to sign it. All right. The lawyer in me wants to say that if you ever need to have your session meetings be official, having 2 people witness them is what the law will recognize. All right. So when we get to the checklist this afternoon, do not flip out if you only have 1 signature. I will not be faulting you for it. But if your minutes ever needed to be looked at legally, and you just have the clerk, Well, you know, the clerk could have lied. Who knows if the clerk lied? I know none of you would, but legally, but you have 2 witnesses, that makes it much more official.
Can I back up a minute?
Sure.
Can the clerk of session serve as the moderator?
No.
No.
Why, are you serving as moderator?
Who else is going to herd this band of cats?
There should be a pastor or a commission ruling elder who's doing this, or a moderator appointed by the presbytery for you. One of the 3. So if you should, Lisa Niven, the co-chair of COM, is here, and she should be appointing somebody if you don't have somebody. So yeah.
We have somebody appointed to our church.
Right. And then you contact that person ahead of time. Now, when you have that kind of situation, you're doing much more of the work because you know your congregation and they initially don't. But they should have somebody appointed for you. All right. Other questions on that? All right, so basic locating information. Most of that you'll know ahead of time, except what time you're going to adjourn, right? I keep a list, when I do this for our council, I keep a list of all the council members right there, and then I just move them down to absent if they're not there, so I don't have to go looking for names later, right? Much easier. Moderator requirements. It sort of picks up the last question. If you have an installed pastor, that person ordinarily moderates your session meetings. If the installed pastor can't do it, he or she may invite another minister from the presbytery to serve in their place. So pastor who was pregnant ends up having a baby. All right, we've had this situation, right? Early. She can call somebody else and say, another minister, will you step in for me? That's fine. All right? Or if there's an associate that's there, that's fine. That person can step in on invitation. If you don't have an installed pastor, COM will appoint somebody. If you have a stated supply, that person is appointed for the year to moderate. If you have a commission ruling elder serving your congregation, that person is appointed for the year to moderate. But if you're not in any of those situations, you should be in touch with COM. COM will appoint someone. If you get stuck at the last minute, I almost hate to say this because I like having once in a while an evening to myself, but Gavin and I, the GP and the stated clerk, are given permission to moderate any session meeting or any congregational meeting without having to go to COM. So in a real pinch when something comes up, one of the 2 of us can do that. So 1 and then 2.
We have a retired minister in our congregation. Does he have to be approved?
He has to be approved by COM.
Does the person have to be a member of the church?
No, the person will be probably a teaching elder, so they will not be a member of any church. They will usually be a minister from another congregation, or a retired minister, or a minister who's doing a validated ministry, etc., who will be appointed for you. Once in a while, we have trained people who are, I know the 2 of you did moderator training, right? So we've trained people who are ruling elders to also moderate other congregations, and we have often allow that. So at the moment, for instance, in Mount Vernon, Yvette Swayze Lifton is moderating. She's a ruling elder in one congregation, moderating another congregation.
Parish associates?
Parish associates, you must get permission from COM in order to have them be the moderator. All right. You should be keeping track of attendance. This includes guests that are at your meeting. Somebody comes into your meeting who is there, make sure their names are down. A declaration of the quorum. It's your job to declare that there is a quorum and to obviously know what the quorum is, so you could declare that, right? So you declare at the beginning of each meeting there was a quorum. You have the congregation approve, the session approve the agenda. That should be shown in your meeting, that the agenda was approved. You may do all of these things in one line. Is there a motion to the fact that we have a quorum? Is there a motion to approve the agenda and the minutes from last meeting? Right? This could be on the consent agenda. When we do the presbytery minutes, for instance, I put the approval of the presbytery minutes right on the consent agenda. And when we move the consent agenda, we've moved all of it. All right? So you can make it easy, but it must be in your minutes that it's happened. And approval of minutes from previous months. If the minutes are corrected, you don't include the changes, you just note that they're corrected. because you're going to correct them. Record the actions, not the discussions. It doesn't matter that Gene said this and then Kyle responded that, and it doesn't matter. You don't need to record all that. You record the motions. If you need to make it clear that there was a lot of discussion before the motion, after a long discussion, the session moved, seconded, and approved the following. All right? But that means that most of the things that are going to be controversial will not be in your minutes. I've had 2 congregations recently, both of whom are really worried that their congregations could see their minutes because there's controversial stuff in there. There shouldn't be. All right? Your minutes should be motions and just motions. The controversial stuff should not be there. Do not put it in. We talked about so-and-so and whether she's really a good member of the session. That doesn't go in your minutes. All right? It's not a wise thing to do. We thought the treasurer was absconding with funds, but we really don't know. Don't put that in your minutes.
There was a situation where the moderator of the deacon board brought up some controversial issues with another member of the
Okay.
church, and there was a long discussion on it.
So unless there was a motion, we discuss the issues that have come up with the Board of Deacons. Right? We're going to talk about if there are times, and we'll get to this later, but if there are times when there are things that are really controversial, there are several ways to do it. You can go into an executive session. Those minutes don't go in the session minutes, and we're going to talk about how to do that today. So there are ways to handle that. But what's in your minutes usually should be very, very transparent. This is what's happening, what the major motions are. And should the congregations know the motions that you're making? Yes. There's no reason that you should be afraid of somebody needing to see your minutes. So you're recording the actions, not the discussions. You also, by the way, do not editorialize. Don't we pass this really awful motion. Nobody cares what you think about it. This is minutes. Right? You record the final wording of the main motion and what happened to them, and that's all you put in. Did it pass? Did it fail? Was it tabled? Those things go down. You record even failed points of order or appeals. So a motion that doesn't make it in, that you discussed and was put up, still goes. It's clear that you discussed it. It's in your minutes. All right. Don't record, I can say this till I'm blue in my face, but if it's a ballot, you put the number for and the number against. You do not record abstentions. And if you're asking people to count, you do not count abstentions. You will notice every once in a while at a presbytery meeting, somebody will say, I abstain, and the current moderator looks at me like, well, what do I do now? And the answer is you ignore it, because Robert's Rules does not have a place for abstentions. All right? Abstaining is like voting no. And so just vote no if you don't want the motion. But there's no such thing as an abstention for our purposes.
Sometimes in the past I've used abstentions essentially to excuse people who might have conflicts.
That's different. Then you say, so-and-so was excused.
Somebody abstained because
Right.
somebody didn't vote because of the...
Right, you may put that. That's very important to put. If there's a conflict of interest, because most sessions also serve as the trustees, if there's a conflict of interest, so-and-so was excused and did not vote because of a conflict of interest. But don't put abstention, because that means they voted and they say, I abstain.
So when you say an abstention is a no vote, let's say you have, 11 people on your session, you need 6 votes to pass.
Right.
But whatever, 5 people abstain, or 6 people abstain, you're not going to pass it because
Right.
you don't have a majority
So
on the session.
right. So it's equivalent of voting against whatever's up there. You don't count it as a no vote. You're only counting the actual yeses and nos.
But we don't have a majority.
But you don't have enough of a majority if people abstain. Jonah.
Using that example, if someone is excused because of conflict, do you treat the session as 10
Yep.
rather than 11?
No. Your quorum is still your quorum of who's there. So, if you have so many people who have a conflict of interest that you're not going to have a quorum to get the vote, don't bring it. because you've got a problem. All right? Yeah.
If you have someone with conflict of interest, you actually use their name?
You can. So-and-so asked to be excused from the vote because of. All right. Summarize oral reports. A report was given from the Buildings and Grounds Committee about how to fix the roof. Or it has accepted the bid of $35,000 to put in a new boiler. All right. If you want, you can attach the written reports. It's a nice thing to do. It gives a picture. But you're not required to. All right.
And you can attach it as an appendix?
Yep. You would just put right in your minutes, appendix so-and-so. So look at our Presbytery minutes. Wendy puts right in there, appendix this, appendix that. And then it's just in at the back of your minutes.
The question about reporting abstentions or reporting who votes what. Let's say one of the session members specifically requests that it goes in the minutes if they were against a certain motion. Then you should include it.
Then you need to put it, because usually when you're getting in that is somebody who is going to actually object in a different way. So I have a right, if I vote against an action, to later bring a charge if I think the body was acting inappropriately. And the only way I can do that is if I can show I didn't vote for the motion. So then you record the names, and you will find people who say, I'm going to file a dissent. I want you to record that I voted no. So the answer would be yes. Always do that if that's requested.
Is it the same if somebody asks you to report their abstention?
No abstention. You say to them, there's no abstention. You may record a no, because then you can file and technically, see, here's a fine line. Somebody who doesn't like something and so they abstain, they didn't vote against it, technically, so they can't bring a dissent later. Right? You can only bring a dissent if you voted against something. So you want to say to the person, if you're abstaining because you object to it, you should be voting no. Right? You make sure as well in your session minutes you will include a summary of your question first?
Sometimes people will, like if we're approving the minutes from the last meeting and they weren't there, so they don't vote.
They can vote because they're currently voting on the last minutes. It's sort of weird for them to be, but they can. But you're not going to ask them to abstain.
Well, that's what they tell me. Oh, I abstained, I wasn't here.
No, just don't, no, just, again, it's a reason from my perspective to put it on the consent agenda, so you don't spend a lot of time on that kind of stuff when you've got real business in front of you. Because you'll move the consent agenda all together, and one of those things will be there, and people won't say, well, I want this consent agenda, but I can't vote on.
So if they weren't there, you just say them.
Right. So for instance, we vote as a consent agenda at the Presbytery every Presbytery meeting for the previous meetings, and we never say which of you were here when you voted the consent agenda because your minutes are being approved as part of it. It's not required, so they can technically vote it.
Just clarify, with the consent agenda, then how are the motions that are in the consent agenda, are they identified in any specific way in the
Yes, you must flag that you can either come in with a docket itself, or you can mark them in if they're coming in from individual committee reports with some kind of code. So at the Presbytery, for instance, we mark them with both a bracketed C, and we put them in blue font, in a blue ink rather than in black ink. And so if you were looking through your packet and you were seeing the blue, you would say those are what we're voting for the consent agenda.
But if in the final minutes they're all listed together with some identified?
They can be, you can just put them in they're approved just like anything else, so they can just go into your regular report if you want. Other questions on that? We will come back and spend more time at the consent agenda. So anyway, clerk's report correspondence gets approved here. You should be making sure that you summarize what those are, that you brought any correspondence that's there to the meeting, all right? And that includes, clerk's correspondence includes reporting on baptisms, reporting on the serving of communion, reporting on marriages, reporting on any changes in membership roles. Those need to be written down. So you're reporting that so-and-so will be brought for baptism in 2 weeks. That's nice. That's an important thing because session has to approve it. right? But then you also want to report that they did come for baptism. All right? That's going to be one of the two proofs that that person was baptized. The other one will be your roll book. But suppose your roll book disappears. Right? We've actually had, in my previous congregation, for instance, we had somebody who, at the point that her husband died, got ready to file basically a probate estate to move things to her name, and one of the children contested that, and the court said, okay, you need to bring in a record of your marriage. It turns out that even though she was married by a minister way before me in this congregation, the marriage never got recorded, and so she couldn't find any legal proof of recording. How did she prove it? We had it in two places. We had it in the roll book, and the clerk, thank goodness for that time, was really good and put down in the minutes that so-and-so was married recently, and the date and so forth. So we had the minister's record, we had the roll book, and we had the recording of the... Otherwise, she would have been stuck. So it's important, you're playing an important role on things like this by recording these things.
We have a very efficient office, and our secretary handles a lot of this stuff. But as the clerk, I should probably go, if
You should.
She should handle it, I should go back and double check it.
Yes,
after it's done.
it's your responsibility, not hers, technically under the Book of Order. So yes, and you should be the one that makes sure it actually goes into the minutes and so forth on a regular basis.
Susan,
Yeah.
when you take people off of the membership roll, do their names need to show up in the minutes?
Yes, when you're making any changes to your membership rolls, and that may be changing somebody from being on your baptismal rolls to being on your active membership rolls because they've been confirmed. That change needs to show up. It may be removing somebody from your rolls or moving them, if you keep an inactive list, to an inactive list. That change needs to show up. So it should be there as well. Because down the road, somebody may want to transfer, and you've got to know, were they ever a member, right? Do you want to move them back? They're saying, I used to be a member of that church. You may be willing to move them back to your active rolls. How would you know they were a member? If you don't keep inactive rolls and you're not required to, it would be only your minutes that would show that they had been there and been moved off. So changes in membership, among the other things there. You keep a copy of your treasurer's report, should be in your minutes. What is the treasurer reported on a regular basis? All right. This doesn't mean you have to have a full balance sheet every month in your minutes. But if the treasurer's reporting, pledges are coming in late, we're 3 months behind, that kind of report should generally be in there. Report from your pastor or staff. Now this is not the I visited 5 people and they were really, the people we were worried about. This is major things that the pastor's doing. Not, I had to go out with the snow blower on Sunday because the driveway wasn't plowed correctly. All right, that's not what we're talking about. All right, we're talking about major issues that your staff are reporting that are there. Yeah.
Our pastor is the moderator, so in our, it's listed as moderator's report.
That's fine. That's fine. But if you have more than one staff, for instance, you may have other pastors. Committees and commission reports. All right, again, that they've reported is worth noting. If there's no motion, the committee, the blank so-and-so committee reported on what it's doing. You may want to put a little bit more detail. You don't need much more detail than that.
A lot of times, committee people will come in and say, I don't have a report.
The committee was coming in.
They'll say, I don't have a report, no report, no report, no report.
That's fine. Then don't put it in. If there's no report, they didn't report.
How often can you do that? No report.
You don't need to put anything. Just as if they didn't do anything. All right. On the other hand, if it happens every month, you want to say, well, so is your committee doing anything? Do we need this committee? Those are fair questions that you, as clerk, you should be raising at some point. For the last year, the so-and-so committee has reported nothing happening. Do we need this committee? None of us, I think this is probably true across the board in all of our congregations, none of us need more committee work than we have. And so if there's not a committee that's needed, don't keep it. Now there's certain committees, you have to have a nominations and representation committee. You have to have that. All right? You have to have a session. You have to have, if you have a bicameral board, you have to have trustees. But you don't have to have a budget finance committee. You don't have to have a buildings and grounds committee. You don't have to have a deacons. You don't, if they're doing something, you have to have it. Somebody has that responsibility. When there's not a committee, it falls to the session. But you're not required to have committees that aren't doing anything.
And do session members have to be chair people of those committees?
Session members have to.
Be chair people of those committees?
It depends on your congregation. Some people will have chair people who have are not sitting on the session. Some people, and they just come in and report for separately. Some people will have session members only chairing committees. It really depends on how your congregation is set up.
Should be in your bylaws?
It ideally should be in your bylaws or your standing rules, your book of manual of operations. Guest speakers. You do not need to have guest speakers. You're not going to be recording down what they said. They're guest speakers.
At the session meeting.
Yeah. Right. They're guest speakers, right? They're not making a motion. They can't make a motion. They don't have the authority to make a motion, so you're not recording that. You have them there. So-and-so was a guest speaker. If you want, it's not, and you know, they're giving a major report. So-and-so came in to talk to us about a minute for mission on this topic. I guess you can put that in one sentence, but it's not part of your official minutes. All right? In property, when you are dealing with property, all right, you need to include, whenever you're dealing with property, if you're selling it, if you're taking out a mortgage on it, if you're receiving real property, if you're changing in any way, you need to include the name, address, and the legal description of the property that you're dealing with. If you're selling or leasing property, the name of the buyer or the leasee, the sale price and terms. If you're taking out a loan, the loan amount and the terms. And you may not sell, lease for more than a period of 5 years, etc., a piece of property without the permission of the presbytery. So when you got that concurrence from the presbytery, that date has to go down.
For over 5 years.
If you are leasing a piece of property for 5 years or more, or you are, if it's your sanctuary that's being leased, anytime your sanctuary is being leased, you're supposed to get the approval of presbytery. All right. Now, having said that, this is not the church next door is doing renovations and they can't be in their sanctuary for next Sunday's service. They've asked, can they use ours in the afternoon? Do you need to get the presbytery's permission? No, for something like that. But we're talking about regular usage is what we're looking at here. But whenever you do it, all these things must be down. If you take out a mortgage, you decide you're going to borrow against your endowment. I don't care where you're taking out the mortgage. You're going to borrow against your endowment and take out a mortgage. All right? You're not using your own money. You're taking a mortgage at a bank. You need to get presbytery's permission.
What if a property has been deeded to the church by someone who passed away?
You need to get presbytery's permission to own that property. So even if it's your next door neighbor and your parking lot, when cars have been going out, they've been driving over this little strip of land, foot wide. And they say, fine, you're using it anyway, we'll just give it to you. It's a foot of land. You still need to get presbytery's permission.
Even if it's not located next to
Yep, no matter where it is.
So if we're renting out space to other congregations or whatever, we need presbytery approval if they've been there for an extended period of time.
If you're giving them an approval to be there for 5 or more years, yes.
So we're still using the space, but just they're using it during our off time or whatever.
Yes, but if you are actually giving them a lease to use the space for 5 or more years, you must get presbytery's permission. If you are giving them, it depends how you're doing it. So if you're saying, yes, this year this works. If you give them a year's lease, no. And then at the end of the year you're giving them another year's lease, no. But if you're giving them, in the future, 5 years, you have the right to use this congregation's space in this way, you must get presbytery's permission.
Depending on the term.
Yeah, and what the terms are. We're going to talk in the next session about when you can do your property that way and the consequences of that. That's a whole different thing of how you use property. But in these cases, I'm just concerned about what goes into your minutes All right, we'll come back and spend more time on property in the 11 o'clock session. You should put in any commissioners that are elected to go to your synod, your presbytery, etc. When they come back, reports from them should be put in there. Approval of baptism and communion dates. Examination of new members. Yes, you are supposed to examine your new members. Congregations do this in a whole series of different ways. Some of them call them one by one in front of the session and ask them what they believe and discuss with them whether they're going to serve on a committee and do all those kinds of things. Other congregations have a tea, and they invite all the session and all the new members. And at the tea, they go around and they share why they're joining the church and what. I don't care how you do it. It has to be recorded that it's happened, that the new members have been examined in one way or another by the session.
So again, you don't need to put down what they said.
Nope. Just that the session has examined and approved them for membership. Reception of new members. Once you've examined them, when did they join? That goes in the minutes. If you remove, this is Deb's question, if you remove members, it goes into the minutes as well. Ordination and installation dates. That's for ruling elders that are coming on, deacons that are coming on. Ordination is for them. Installation for people who have already served in that position but are re-upping in one way or another. You need to make sure those are in your minutes. Okay. Too often, when I've read minutes more carefully for other situations, I find congregations that say so-and-so has been elected to the session, and then I suddenly begin to see their name on the session minutes, but I don't see when they officially were installed. Even if you've been on for 3 years and you're coming on for another 3 years, do you need to be reinstalled? Yes, you do. All right. So it needs to show up in your minutes. If you have congregational meetings coming up that you've chosen, when are those? When is that going to happen? What's the agenda? If this is your annual meeting that you have that's in your bylaws, you just say that, our annual meeting. But if there's for something else, you need to state what is the topic of the special meeting that you're calling. That needs to show up in your session minutes. If your pastor gets, how many of you have housing allowance for your pastors versus Manses? Housing allowance. If your pastor gets housing allowance, it must be in your minutes. If it changes in a year or if it stays the same in a year. Every time your first session meeting of a year or your last session meeting of the previous year, if you're really good, you must put down what the pastor's current housing allowance is for the next year. Otherwise, technically, they're not allowed to take it. And you will have a really, if they ever got audited by the IRS and they said, well, I have this, but this is housing allowance, and they say, show where your board voted that, and it's not in your minutes, they have to report that and pay tax on that.
We normally have the congregation vote on that, and it appears in the minutes of the annual congregational meeting. That okay?
The actual amount of the housing allowance appears? Yes, as long as it's there. Sometimes pastors will not put it there, they'll break it out otherwise.
But in any case, the minutes of the annual congregational meeting.
Yes, as long as you then have your annual congregational meetings minutes approved somehow, either by the session or by the next.
All right, our unique position is the parish pays pastor. How do I include that parish decision? Do I have to put their entire council meeting as an agenda or as an amendment to our meeting?
You have to somewhere at least put in the salary and the housing allowance from that into your minutes. Just report it the next January. So this was acted on by the parish, and I'm reporting this. And once you've reported under your clerk's report, it's in there. Otherwise, the pastor's got a problem.
All that should be the pastor's terms of call, should have been.
Initially, yes.
Should have sent and approved has to be approved by the presbytery.
Yes.
So.
But
Just include the terms of call in the minutes.
yes, but you'll remember when I referred to the annual things that you have to do, one of the things is to submit to the presbytery the terms of call. About a third of our congregations don't do that. And so the only place for pastors where, and pastors find out afterwards when they see the report come out 3 or 4 months later and their name isn't down. All right, and well, why hasn't it been reported? In the meanwhile, there's nothing, until that's either reported to the presbytery officially to make it that official, or there's something in your congregation session minutes that make the housing allowance official. Technically, for those months, the pastor shouldn't be claiming housing allowance. They should be reporting that as salary. And that's a terrible position to put a pastor in. So please, please make sure you have it ideally both places. CON was joking, not quite joking, a year or so ago to say that we were going to begin to report to the Board of Pensions the last figures that we got from congregations, which in some cases would be 5 or 6 years ago, because people haven't sent in that congregational change form for pastors. And in those situations, it would be a real problem for those pastors. But it seemed unfair because it was the congregation that wasn't putting it in, not the pastor, to penalize the pastor. So that's why COM didn't do it. But we were trying to figure out some way to get those forms in. And so because of that, at least cover for your pastor by making sure it's also in your minutes. Approve the budget. Again, congregations do not approve budgets. Sessions do. You need to very clearly have that somewhere in your minutes for where you've approved the budgets. And ideally, if there is a calendar of events, if you have a calendar of events that you want to remind people of, you may want to put that in your minutes as well. Things that are coming up that the session is doing. You're not required to, but it's not a bad thing to have them there. Upcoming things are going to be happening that the session should be paying attention to. We are doing a major fundraiser on this date. And that helps when committees are looking at previous minutes and trying to figure out what they're doing for the future. And if they're going to plan an event themselves, they have other events there. So it's helpful in that way. Questions on session minutes?
Just as far as reception of new members or baptism when it's recorded, is it just because reviewing other minutes over the years, what's the correct way? Do you need to say Jane Doe joined the church by profession of faith, previously baptized, the whole thing? Because other times I've seen minutes written where it just said Jane Doe joined the church.
No, you need to put down what category they've joined by.
Same with baptism. It needs to be the child's parents,
right,
when they were born.
Right. And in your roll book, you'll be putting for women maiden names as well, although more women have kept their maiden names. But if they haven't maiden names, you'll be putting parents there for the children, etc. But the same information would go into your session minutes. So again, we're looking for duplicates in case there's a problem down the road. Yeah. And you want to make sure there's an agreement about what's in your roll book and what's in your session minutes. So those of you, for instance, I had one clerk of session come up to me and say that she didn't know what to do about her roll book because she'd just taken over as clerk and the information was not in there. And the answer is you should be able to reconstruct that if your minutes have been done well from the minutes that are previous minutes, what's missing. That's assuming that that was reported correctly, but the same information should be there.
Yeah, and the statistical reports, when we go through it, we always say, if there's only a way that we know how old these people are, well, you just ask them.
Right.
Right. They say, what is your date of birth?
Right. So this past year, I know one congregation that got very frustrated at that. That they were guessing, what is your age? Do you have any disabilities that you think we should be aware of for that form? How do you want to characterize yourself in racial, ethnically, etc.? And they just sent out an email to everybody and said, we have to report this, and would you please answer the following questions for us? If you don't, we will not be reporting that line. But, how do you have I wear a hearing aid sometimes, so you might know I have a hearing loss. But a lot of people, you don't know. How do I guess? Well, you seem not to hear me sometimes when I speak, so I'll put you down as having a hearing. So it's just easier to ask. And people, this congregation got, I think, 100% response. So they now know they have birth dates, they have disabilities, so they can plan for events in the future, etc. So it's an easy thing to do, and they just but now they have to keep it updated, but they've got the general information there now. So yes, just ask.